everyone. So it appears that I'm the only one keeping you from the party and from resting, so I'll get straight into it. Okay. So my name is Sara Soueidan. I'm a front-end developer, and I come all the way from Lebanon. I'm a freelancer, which means that I get to work with different teams and different clients across the world that have different teams. But usually, all of my work usually happens with a group or a team of designers, UI and UX designers. I'm usually involved from the beginning. I'm the front-end developer on the team, but I'm usually involved from the beginning in the design process. And I give feedback about the UI in general, about the UX, and any considerations that need to be taken into account when it comes to accessibility. Like if there's a problem with the design or a possibility that something might come up when it comes to the functionality and accessibility of the design, I give feedback about that. And some other times, I'm brought into a team after all of the decisions have been made. And so I have to make do with whatever I've been given. So I'm there to put life into the design using code. And I need to make sure that I do that with as much accessibility built in as possible. Now, about 4 years ago, I did not even know anything about accessibility. I don't even remember how I encountered the word accessibility for the first time, but I think it was somewhere over on Twitter. I felt extremely terrible knowing that I had been building websites that were non-inclusive for a lot of users. I felt that that was completely irresponsible, and I'm not an irresponsible person. So I started wanting to learn more and to read more, and so I did. I followed a lot of people on Twitter who were doing accessibility and reading their articles and following their work, etc. And over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, learning about the fundamentals of accessibility has fundamentally changed the way I look at and see the designs, the way I approach thinking and building those designs and writing code. Now, in this talk, I want to share some of the things that I learned over the course of the last few years, just very few things because we have a very limited amount of time. And I'm hoping that there will be a lot of very practical takeaways for you that you can take away and apply to your projects, current or future ones, to make them much more accessible. Now, at the foundation of every accessible website is semantic markup. Semantic HTML, semantic markup, or semantic HTML is descriptive HTML. Each HTML element describes the type of content that it creates. So if you have a heading in the design, you use the heading element, H2, H1, H3, H4, etc. If you have a paragraph, you use the P tag. If you have a navigation, you use the nav element. If you have a button, you use a button, not a div. Now, in other words, it means using the correct element using the correct HTML elements for their correct purpose as much as possible. Now, in design, usually visual design, headings define visual hierarchy. Areas and white space on the page define which content is the main content and which content is complementary. A sighted user can get a clear skeleton of the page just by quickly scanning the page with their eyes, but a non-sighted user cannot do that. Now, using HTML5 sectioning elements, such as the section, the main, the nav, header, footer, aside, all of these region elements, it is important because it will allow screen reader users to get a skeleton of the page similar to what a sighted user can get from looking at the page. It allows them to skip areas that they don't want to, and jump into areas that they want to. So if they want to skip everything in the header and everything in the sidebar and skip straight to the main content, they can do that. Now, screen reader users use what is known as a rotor to navigate a web page. The rotor is like power commands, but for screen reader users. It increases their efficiency and facilitates their browsing the web. Now, using the rotor, and if the document is using semantic markup and proper sectioning elements, the user can move from one area of the page to another without having to go through the content in each section. So what I did there was jump straight to the main section by skipping everything that was before it. And it is very, very, very important for them to be able to do that. But the document structure in the rotor, the heading, the areas, the navigation, all of these things that you just saw, they are defined by the document structure in your HTML. So if you don't provide a heading in your HTML, it's not going to be there. The skeleton is not going to be, it's going to be broken basically, and they're not going to be able to navigate the way they would normally be able to if semantic HTML was being used. If you don't use a landmark element like navigation, aside for a sidebar, footer for a footer, header, etc., it won't show up in the rotor, and so the user won't be able to jump to it. Now, a few days ago, I think that was like over the weekend, I think one of my Twitter followers, I'm going to switch display here. One of my Twitter followers was asking the accessibility community on Twitter about a video that he had seen not a long while ago that showed the importance of using headings and landmarks. There we go. That I thought was very interesting and I wanted to share with you. So this is a video by Microsoft, and it shows you the importance of using landmarks and headings for a real screen reader user and how important it can be for them in a very cute gamification kind of way. We have audio.
Surprise party for her son's birthday.
Sorry, my bad.
Animation in the style of an 8-bit video game. Woman in room.
Hope has spent all day preparing a surprise party for her son's birthday.
Oh no! I forgot the cake! I'd better get online and find a bakery fast.
Hope rushes to her PC to search for a solution.
Bing, the search engine, responds.
I've found a site that can help you out.
The Bingo Bakery website appears. Hope spawns at the top of the page. The Bing logo as a character with googly eyes descends.
Here we are. Nice site, isn't it?
I guess, but I can't really tell. I have trouble seeing well, and it looks like this site has very limited accessibility.
Really? Let me take a look with the lights out.
A pull cord swings down. Bing pulls it to turn out the lights.
Bingo Bakery, homepage.
There's nothing to land on!
Hope falls and loses a life.
Oh, I see what you mean. Let me see what the developers can do about this.
A pop-up menu appears. The difficulty level changes from impossible to challenging. Hope spawns again at the top of the page. Bing descends.
Sorry about that. Here, take this developer power-up.
A pop-up menu with an image of shoes and the code for tabbing appears.
These shoes of tabbing will allow you to move from tab to tab on the page. Good luck, and make haste.
Bing ascends out of frame. The shoes of tabbing flash onto Hope's feet. The lights go out again. All page tabs are visible.
Bingo Bakery, homepage, 18 links.
Okay, I've got 18 links. I wonder how many I'll have to jump through to get where I need to go.
Hope jumps to a link.
Services.
Nope, that's not what I'm looking for. I need a ready-made cake.
A timer counts down.
Catering. Locations. Contact. Style. List with 3 options.
Hope climbs down the list.
Square. Pan sheet. Flavor. List with 3 options. Chocolate. White. Spice.
This seems like a build-your-own-cake section. I don't have time for that. I just want a pre-made cake.
Frosting. List with 3 options.
Time is up. The bakery is closed. Hope loses a life. She has 2 left. Image of a closed sign. Bing appears.
Goodness, this is harder than it should be. Let me see if the developers can help again.
A pop-up menu appears. The difficulty level changes from challenging to inefficient. Hope spawns again at the top of the page. Bing descends.
Still having trouble? Here, try this developer bonus.
A pop-up menu with an image of a technical device and the code for landmarks.
This landmark teleportation device will allow you to teleport to landmarks on the page. Good luck, and make haste.
Bing ascends out of frame. The teleportation device flashes onto Hope's wrist. The lights go out. All page tabs and landmarks are visible.
Bingo Bakery, homepage, 18 links, 4 landmarks.
Okay, let's see what's on this page.
Hope teleports.
Navigation landmark, list with 6 items, bingo, homepage button.
Okay, that's where I am now. What's next?
Main landmark, list with 11 items, style link.
Well, that was a nice jump.
Hope jumps.
Flavor, list with 3 options. Frosting, list with 3 options. More. Birthday, list with 2 options.
Is this a pre-made cake section?
Hope climbs.
Image of a round cake with happy birthday written on top. Flavor, white. Frosting, vanilla. Decoration, red.
Yes, this is it.
Time is up. The bakery is booked full. Hope loses a life. She has 1 left. Image of a booked order form. Bing appears.
Getting closer. Let me see if the developers have anything else up their sleeves.
A pop-up menu. The difficulty level changes from inefficient to effortless. Hope spawns again at the top of the page. Bing descends.
You almost made it that time. Here's one more developer gift that can help you out.
A pop-up menu with an image of a gun and the code for headings.
This grappling gun of headings will allow you to swing 2 headings on the page. Good luck, and make haste.
Bing ascends out of frame. The gun flashes into Hope's hand. The lights go out. All page tabs, landmarks, and headings are visible.
Bingo Bakery. Homepage. 18 links. 4 landmarks. 3 headings.
All right, this is my last chance. I have to make it this time.
Hope teleports.
Navigation landmark. List with 6 items. Bingo. Homepage button. Main landmark. List with 14 items. Build your own heading.
Okay, what's the next heading?
Hope shoots and grapples to the next heading.
Pre-made cakes.
Yes, here we are.
Hope jumps.
Birthday. List with 2 options.
Hope climbs.
Image of a round cake with happy birthday written on top.
That's the one.
Checkout. Time. List with 2 options. Now.
Yes.
Billing. List with 3 options. Cash on delivery.
Yes, please.
Hope jumps to finish button with 1 second remaining. Image of bakery interior as baker hands Hope a cake. Hope is jubilant. Bing appears.
Congratulations, you've ordered your cake in the nick of time.
Hope is back in her house.
Gee, having those extra accessibility options sure made that faster and more enjoyable. I never would have got this cake in time for the party without them.
If you've enjoyed watching that, you're a nerd. I'm guilty. Okay. Back to the presentation. So the long story short is landmarks, headings, semantic HTML is very important because it allows your users to navigate the page more efficiently. Now, this sounds pretty straightforward, right? HTML5 provides some elements, sectioning elements like main nav, header, etc. And we have headings with heading levels, and those can be used to define a document hierarchy similar to the visual hierarchy that users can get. But things aren't always as simple and as straightforward, especially when you're working with designers who they have certain decisions they want to make. Now, that wasn't meant to be like a bad thing, you know. Now, in a project I'm currently working on, it's still a top secret project. I wish I could share it with you because it's one of my absolute favorite things that I've worked on, and I can't wait for it to become public. But for now, I've had to blur some of the logos and some of the things that give out what it is. So I had a couple of interesting scenarios like these. No, not the video. First of all of the content that you're seeing, that is dummy content. So we definitely don't have like those articles like that. So the first one is the simplest scenario. I have a few page templates that simply didn't have any headings associated with the main section of the page. I have a page listing a series of articles like this one. It has a description on top for sighted users and then the list of articles. A sighted user can tell from the logo, because the logo is made up of 2 parts. That is a whole different thing that I could definitely also talk about, but not enough time for that. So a sighted user can tell, just by looking at the page, what these articles are and what the title of the page could be or is. The user can tell what, that these articles are related, and you can see. I built the basic structure of the page, but when I navigated the page using the Rotor, this is using VoiceOver on macOS, by the way, this is the heading structure that I got. I didn't have any structure. I didn't have any hierarchy in there. I had a list of H2s and then a couple of H3s somewhere, and that wasn't very useful. Like, I have a lot of headings, but they don't belong somewhere. There is no title describing what these headings are. And then when I use I'm not nervous because you're standing there. And then when I use the landmarks navigation, I had the banner, which is my header. I had the main navigation landmark, which is the navigation. And then the main section, because it doesn't have a heading, it was using the description, the entire paragraph, to describe that main section. That is wrong, because it's not a title of that section, and it still doesn't tell what that section is, at least not in a good way. So since the design doesn't allow having a visible heading, I added a heading. The solution for this one was pretty straightforward. I added a heading that's only exposed to screen reader users. I have an H1 secret project page title, SR only. This class name, I'll talk a lot about hiding content accessibly in the next section, but for now, it's enough to say that this class applies styles that will hide this piece of text visually, but it's still making sure that it's accessible for screen readers. We'll see the CSS associated with that in the next section. Now, adding a title to the sections where one was missing, adding a title where it was missing is pretty straightforward. You can add that. It doesn't show up. It doesn't break the design, and it's available for screen readers. And now if you open the Rotor again, the headings, you will have a title, and then underneath that, you will have the hierarchy with all the article titles belonging to it. But then there were also instances where it looked like there was no heading, but in reality, there was one. So a couple of the pages looked like this. So if you were on the main articles page, on the archive page, and you click on one of the tags, it takes you to the tag results page. So at this page, it shows you the resources tagged with generative. There's a description on top, and there's a sidebar. So at first glance, when I looked at this, it looked something like this in my head. This is how I was going to section it, whether it was using divs were appropriate or the main section element, the sidebar, etc. This is what it looked like initially. But when I thought about it from a screen reader perspective, about the page structure, and navigating it using landmarks and headings, I knew that something weird was going to happen. And it's because of this little heading here. So let me go back here again. It's a heading in the sidebar. So first I thought that, OK, I have a main section. It doesn't have a heading. I can add that similar to what I did previously. But if I'm going to mark the sidebar up, a couple of issues are going to appear here. So I have two headings in my sidebar, or so it appears. The first heading says resources tagged with, and the second heading says popular topics. So my first issue is that I have a heading that's incomplete, a heading that says resources tagged with. That's not a heading. It's not like, imagine that appearing in the Rotor. Resources tagged with what? Okay, so the first thing that I thought of was the whole thing is a heading. Resources tagged with generative. This is the heading. And whether it looks like one piece of text or not, underneath, when it comes to HTML and when it comes to semantics, it is still one heading. So that was the first thing that I thought of. I need to wrap this in a heading, and then maybe wrap the generative part in a span, set the display to block, add some margin on top so it looks like it's not part of it, but a screen reader user knows that this is a heading that says resources tagged with generative. So that was the first issue. The second issue was, OK, so now I have a heading that makes more sense, but what is it a heading for? I have my sidebar. It has a heading that says resources tagged with generative, and then another heading that says popular topics with a list of hashtags. That doesn't make sense. And my main section still doesn't have a heading. But a sighted user knows that this heading in the sidebar is the heading of the entire page. It's the heading of the main section. It is what defines what those articles are. So instead of thinking of it like this, with a side element for the sidebar and with a heading inside of it, I decided to split it because that heading, the resources tagged with generative, doesn't belong in the sidebar. It doesn't really belong there. Even if it's visually positioned that way, it shouldn't be there. And well, yeah, that's pretty much it, really. I have a heading. It's not part of the sidebar. It's not part of that section, especially when it comes to laying elements out in CSS. If I put that heading inside of that main section, positioning it using CSS grid is going to be a little bit trickier because it's inside of a container, and the container is in the grid. So I ended up separating it, and because I wanted the screen reader user to know that this title describes the main content of the page, I didn't want it to use that description again as a title for the main area. I ended up marking up like this. So I have my main area where all of my content is. I used AriaLabelBy. I'll talk about AriaLabelBy in the next section as well. I gave an ID to my heading. My heading also has that span with a different styling, and I told the screen reader that the main heading is using this as a title, or this heading is the title of my main section. Now, without knowing about fundamentals of accessibility, about the Rotor, and about how screen reader users navigate a web page, without knowing about the importance of document structure for screen reader users, I would not have thought about it this way. Never in a million years, probably. I mean, you see something, you style it. And also note that this is an H1 heading. It's not an H3 or an H4 or an H5. It's almost the size of the text, which would probably normally kind of look like an H6 because H6 headings have the same size of the text, but in this case it's not really an H6, it's an H1, it's the title of the main section. So you mark it up semantically, you give it the element that describes what it is, a heading of the main section, H1, and then you style it in your CSS any way you want to. Now, if I open this page using the rotor again, with the headings, I have more hierarchy. I have an H1 that says resources tagged with generative, and then a list of those resources. If I use the landmarks navigation, it says I have a header, I have the main navigation, I have a main section that has a title, resources tagged with generative. And the user can jump to that main section and then scroll through the page or navigate through it. So the main takeaways from this are, use HTML5 landmarks, do not skip them, do not use divs everywhere. You have the elements in your HTML, so why don't you use them? Provide headings where needed and follow headings order on the page. Do not skip headings. So just because a heading looks small doesn't mean that it is an H6 or an H5. Use appropriate heading levels and then style them in your CSS any way you want. If a heading is missing or if it's meant to be visually hidden, provide one for screen reader users only. Now, a survey of screen reader users, I think it was last year or the year before, showed that 80% of screen reader users will use regions to navigate a web page. But they can only do so if you provide them with a semantic markup that allows them to do it. If you don't use semantic HTML, you take away your user's ability to navigate your content, which can cause a lot of frustration and counterproductivity, and which is really mean. I mean, if you know that you should be using them and you don't, that's mean. Now, in addition to facilitating user navigation, using proper HTML elements or semantics ensures that the user gets a clear idea of the elements, of what the elements are on the page, what each one is, how they can be interacted with. Now, I'm not talking about landmarks and headings anymore. And they can tell what the element is, what it does, and how it can be interacted with by means of an accessibility tree. If you're a web developer, front-end developer specifically, you need to be familiar with the accessibility tree if you want to build accessible user interfaces. The accessibility tree is a structure parallel to the DOM tree. For every meaningful, emphasis on meaningful, for every meaningful DOM element, an accessibility object is created and exposed to the user. Assistive technology uses the accessibility tree to expose the content and information to the user. So the HTML that you write is used to generate the DOM tree, and then the DOM tree is translated into the primary visual representation of the page, and in parallel, it's also used to generate the accessibility tree. But not everything that is presented visually on the page is presented to the screen readers. Sometimes you hide elements using CSS display none, for example, or sometimes you hide them using any other different way. So what you see on the page is not always what you get for screen readers, and vice versa. So similar to what we did with the heading, it wasn't there visually, but it was there for screen readers in the accessibility tree. Now, so the accessibility tree is normally a subset of the DOM tree. I'm saying subset because elements, non-meaningful elements, such as the div and the span. Div and span do not have any semantic meaning. So they're not meaningful, and they're not going to be exposed to screen reader users. So the accessibility tree is a subset of the DOM tree, and it is affected by both the markup that you write and the styles that you apply to the DOM. Native HTML elements are implicitly mapped to accessibility APIs. For example, an image element will automatically be mapped to an accessibility node or object with a role image and a label or a name based on the alt attribute. So I have an image that links to some source, and it has an alt text that describes that image. And the object in the accessibility tree looks something like that. It has a role of an image and a name inferred from the alt attribute. Similarly, other semantic native elements are exposed, all together forming an accessibility tree that looks something like this. So you can think of the accessibility tree as a tree of objects. An object is created for every meaningful HTML element, and that object may expose the name of that element, what it is, the role, for example, it's a button, it's a checkbox. What its current value is, for example, a slider has a specific value set, it tells the user what that value is. What its current state is, checkbox can be checked or not checked. It also announces that state, how it can be interacted with. It can be pressed, incremented, decremented. Your markup informs the objects created. That's why using appropriate elements for content is extremely important to convey information to screen reader users. Now, we can check how our elements are being translated by inspecting the accessibility tree in the DevTools. For example, a simple button with a piece of text inside of it will show up in the DevTools as an object with a name that is, you get that name from the contents of the text and a role of the button. This is the Chrome DevTools. Right next to the Styles tab, you have the Accessibility tab, and inside of that, you can expect the accessible object associated with each element that you're inspecting. Now, the only reason this button has a meaningful button role and a name is because we use the button element. Now, I'm going to do just a little bit of live coding. I'm not going to mess things up, I promise. This is Chrome. This is my pen. Okay. So if I don't use the button element, okay, I have a div here. I know that a lot of developers do this. Most of the times what I used to hear is they don't use the button element because it's not easily stylable. It is. I'll show you proof shortly. So if you don't use the button element, how is this button going to be exposed to a screen reader user? Let's see. So I open my DevTools. I select my button, and I go to accessibility. Can you see this? No, it's way too small. So what does the object say about it? Nothing. When a screen reader wants to announce this element to the user, it doesn't announce anything. It just says group. Because a div is a grouping element, and it's a meaningless grouping element. It's a generic container, as you can see here. It doesn't have a label. It doesn't have a name associated with it, not even using the text inside of it. OK, so some developer could be like, OK, you can use Aria roles to make up for that. You can announce it as a button by saying role button. That's true. No. I'm going to refresh. Yes. Now let me inspect it again. OK, so now the accessible object says that this is a button. It's using the content of that button, the word submit, as an accessible name. That's pretty cool. That should be enough, right? So a screen reader is going to announce this as submit button. It first announces the name, and then the type or the role of the element. Submit button. But that's not really enough, because when the user comes across a button, they expect a certain behavior. Okay, they expect to be able to operate that button in a specific way. First of all, if I'm tabbing through the page, I'm not tabbing on that element. It's not tabbable. A div is not tabbable. OK, so why not add tab index 0? Now I can tab through it. OK. That solves that. That's pretty easy, right? Now it's a button. No, not really. Because now you can tab to it, but you cannot operate it using the enter key and the space key. When a user comes across a button, it expects a specific behavior. They expect to be able to operate it, click it, using the space key and the enter key. So now you're going to have to add that functionality using JavaScript. But why do that? I mean, first of all, just a quick note about tab index. Just in case you're not familiar with it, tab index is used to indicate the tab order, or how an element behaves in the tab order of the page. If an element is not tabbable and you set the tab index to 0, it becomes part of the tabbing order. If you set tab index to -1, it does the opposite. It prevents it from being tabbable. But then you can also use JavaScript to click it or to add an event to it. And you can also use positive values, but we should never, ever do that, because it messes up with the tab order of the page. So usually tab index 0 for making an element tabbable, tab index -1 for making it scriptable and controlling it in JavaScript. Now, I can tab to it, but if I click space or anything, nothing happens. Whereas I could have just done this from the start. I'm applying the same class name to both the div and the button, and they look exactly the same. So why not just use the button to begin with? And the button comes with all of the functionality built in. It's a native element. It's tabbable. I can tab it. I didn't have to add anything. I didn't have to add any accessibility roles. It's read out to accessibility to the screen reader users as a button. And I can operate it using the space key and the enter key. It just works. OK, moving on. So when you have a simple button with a piece of text inside of it, it is exposed to screen reader users using the text as a name for that button. So using VoiceOver on Mac OS, I tap to that button, and it's announced by VoiceOver as send message button. But in this section, I want to talk about a specific kind of buttons, icon buttons. An icon button is an icon that triggers some sort of action on the page. More accurately, technically speaking, an icon button is still a button, but it contains an icon, but no visible accompanying text. We see these everywhere. They can be found in the majority of user interfaces today. This is the screenshot from the project that I mentioned earlier. It's a search modal overlay. Just a quick side note here. Modal overlays. They suck. Avoid them as much as you can. There is no such thing as an accessible CSS-only modal overlay. There is no such thing as using the checkbox hack to open a modal dialog and being accessible. That is not accessible. A lot more goes into building an accessible modal dialog. You need to be able to manage keyboard focus. When the user closes the dialog, you need to move focus back to the button that triggers it. And so much more goes into creating a modal dialog that there is no such thing as a CSS-only accessible modal dialog. So you need to use JavaScript. If you absolutely have to use a modal dialog, make sure that you use an accessible one. I can share one on Twitter if you're interested. There's one created by my friend Scott O'Hara. He's an accessibility expert. He works with real disabled users. He does all kinds of testing on all kinds of screen readers. He created a modal dialog that I use in all of my projects today. It's 100% accessible. So if you absolutely have to use a modal dialog, use one that is accessible. And Scott's dialog is the one that I can recommend 100%, fully accessible, everything. So icon buttons. In an icon button, there is no text. The icon is supposed to alone convey the meaning and thus the functionality to a sighted user. So if I'm a sighted user, I'm looking at let's say one of these, and the GIF or GIF, GIF. I know that it's used to get a GIF, right? But what about non-sighted users? What about screen reader users? How does an API, an accessibility API, expose such a button to the user? And what name does it use for the button when there is no text in it? Now, just like with the screen reader-only headings, we can provide text for screen readers only to use as an accessible name for the button. We hide that text visually and make it accessible to screen readers. And there are different ways that you can do this. Now, since we'll be talking about hidden content now for the next few minutes, and how that hidden content is exposed or not exposed to screen readers, I want to first cover the basics of hiding content and how that hidden content is exposed to screen readers. So there are currently 4 different properties in CSS that you can use to hide content. The clip path, if you set it to inset 100%, it will hide an element visually on the page. You can set the opacity to 0, which also hides the element visually. You can set the visibility to hidden, so it's hidden, or you can set the display to none. Among these 4, these 2, the visibility hidden and display none, will remove the element that they hide from the DOM and from the accessibility tree, thus making them completely inaccessible. So if you have an element and you still need it to be accessible under the hood, do not use these 2 properties. You can also hide elements using the hidden attribute. The hidden attribute is an HTML5 attribute. It's the equivalent of the CSS display none, but instead of using CSS, you have an HTML attribute for it. Content is hidden. Content that has a hidden attribute on it is hidden both visually and from assistive technologies. It's useful for hiding content when the CSS is disabled, such as in reader modes. So if you write articles, if you have a blog, you write articles, and one of your users is reading your content via a reading app, such as Pocket, or via Safari reading mode, your CSS is going to be disabled in those environments. And if there's an element, anything that you want to hide, even when your CSS is disabled, you can use the hidden attribute to do so. An attribute similar to the hidden attribute is the Aria Hidden attribute. It determines whether an element is hidden from accessibility APIs, if it's true, or not, if it's false. This doesn't affect the visual representation of the element. So if you have an element on the page and you set the Aria Hidden on it, you're hiding it from screen readers, but not visually. It's useful for hiding decorative or duplicative content. So if something should not be announced to a screen reader because it's not useful for them, then it's useful to hide it using Aria Hidden. For example, This can, if you have a button that has both text and an icon inside of it. A screen reader is going to use the accessibility object. The accessibility object can use the text inside of that button as an accessible name. It will announce menu, button, and the icon itself is not really useful in this case. You don't want it to be announced. So you can use Aria Hidden on the SVG to hide it, the SVG icon. And just a quick note here is you will also want to use the focusable attribute and set it to false to prevent the icon itself from being focusable by keyboard. I think the problem is in IE. I'm not sure if it's still in Edge. I even once encountered it in Firefox, but I don't think it's still there. So the thing is that if you have a button and you have an icon, SVG icon inside of it, you tab to that button, you focus the button, and if you tab again, you focus the SVG inside of the button. So the button gets two tab stops, and you don't want that. So in order to avoid that, you can use Focusable False. So Aria Hidden can be used to hide content from screen readers while keeping it visually visible. What if you want to do the opposite? If you want to hide it visually, like we did with the heading, but you still want it to be there for screen readers? Most of the times, you can do that using CSS like this. So this is the utility class that I use in every single one of my projects today. And it is the one that I used for the heading before. This is also written by my friend Scott O'Hara. What this utility class is doing is it's essentially shrinking an element, any element that it's applied to, into a 1 pixel square, hiding any overflow, and absolutely positioning the element so that it removes any trace of that element from the normal document flow. Okay, so we can hide elements visually only, we can hide elements from screen readers only, and we can hide elements from both. Now let's see how these techniques can be used to create icon buttons. There are different ways that you can create an icon-only button and make it accessible. The first one is you can have a button, you can have an icon inside of it, and you can provide screen reader-only text. The text is hidden from your sighted users, which is what you want, but it's still there so that a screen reader API, so that an accessibility API can use it as an accessible name for that button. The icon is useless in this case for screen readers, so in this case, what's going to announce is menu button, and this is what the accessibility tree, the object looks like in the DevTools. The name of the button is inferred from the contents, which is accessible to screen readers. It has a role button, it's focusable, and everything else. Another thing you can do is you can use AriaLabel on the button. So AriaLabel is used to provide an accessible label or an accessible name to the element that it's being applied to. In this case, I want the name to say menu, so I use the string menu inside of the AriaLabel attribute. What the AriaLabel does is it's going to override everything, all the content inside of the button. So even if I have text inside of the button, it's not going to be used as a name for the button anymore. Screen readers are going to announce the name that you have inside of AriaLabel. Now, because my SVG is still there and because there could be bugs anywhere at any time, I still use Aria Hidden and Focusable False to hide it. And this is what the accessibility tree now looks like. I have the menu, the name menu for the button, and that name was being not inferred, like it was getting that name from the AriaLabel attribute. It has a role of the button, it's focusable, etc., etc. You can also make an icon button accessible using AriaLabelBy. So this is where the interesting stuff happens, okay? I still have my SVG in there. I'm not using my SVG to label or to get an accessible name for my content, so I'm hiding it using Aria Hidden and Focusable False again. Now, when you use the difference between AriaLabel and AriaLabelBy is that with AriaLabel, you're giving the name directly inside of the attribute. So this is the name that I want to be used, and I put it inside of the AriaLabel attribute. But with AriaLabelBy, you're telling the screen reader that this button is labeled by another element. This is what I did with the main section before. I told it that this main section is labeled by that heading over there. Now what I'm doing here is I have a span inside of my button. I'm using that as a label inside it has an ID, and I'm referencing that ID inside of AriaLabelBy. But in order to make sure that the content is not visually there, I'm not using screen reader only, because otherwise it's, I mean, if I have SR only, that text, the menu is going to be exposed, and then AriaLabelBy is going to be useless. So I'm using the hidden attribute. I'm setting display none on the span, and then using that as an accessible name. But I mentioned before that if you set the hidden attribute on an element, you're removing that from the DOM and from the accessibility tree. It's not exposed to screen readers anymore. But Even if an element is hidden using display none or the hidden attribute, you can still reference that hidden element and use it as an accessible title and reference it using AriaLabelBy. I want you to remember this. Even if an element is hidden from screen reader users, you can still tell the screen reader user to expose that text to their users. You can tell the screen reader to expose that text to their users. And this is what the accessibility tree looks like. It's telling you that the name of the button is being retrieved from the span that has that particular ID. There are two more ways to create icon buttons. And those two techniques, you can use the SVG itself. You give a name to the SVG itself, and then you let the SVG act as the content of the button and let the Accessibility API use the SVG content as a name for the button. It works, but there are certain browser screen reader combinations that have bugs with those. So if you're interested, I have an article about this. Everything that I just talked about is in there, including the two more techniques, including much more research by my friend Scott O'Hara. If you absolutely have to use one of those two techniques, you can check out the tests that he did and then choose accordingly. Now I want to talk a little bit about infographics and data visualizations. One of the most frequently asked questions that I usually get when talking about SVG and about accessibility in the same context: how do I make data visualizations accessible? Now, data visualizations are a great way to make information stand out and sometimes a lot easier to parse and understand. But they also come with their own accessibility challenges that you need to be aware of. When providing information, you want to make sure that the information is available to all your users, sighted and not sighted users. Now, when it comes to data visualizations on the web, these visualizations are usually created and presented using SVG. SVG is perfect for creating data visualizations because it comes with all of the elements that are needed to create it. We have circles, we have paths. You can create any kind of shape inside of an SVG. And oftentimes, these data visualizations are also interactive and animated, which is also the kind of thing that SVG was made for. Images, shapes that you can also edit, tweak, and animate. But SVG data visualizations are, at the end of the day, just SVG images. It's an image, which means that when a screen reader comes across a data visualization, it will announce it as an image, and it's not going to automatically present the information inside of that image to the user. So you have data, you're presenting data, but that data is not being conveyed to screen reader users. There's no way for them to do it that way. Presenting the information to the user is part of our responsibility. Now, albeit being a perfect candidate for visually representing information, SVG is not equipped with the semantics needed to convey the content of that information to the user, unfortunately. This code is from an article by Leonie Watson in which she talks about how you can kind of turn a bar chart, a very simple bar chart, into a table inside of an SVG using Aria roles. So, quick note, Aria is not there to add functionality to elements. It's only used to add semantic parity with HTML. So if an element is not a button, you can tell it that it's a button. You can add semantics to an element. But just adding role equals button on an element does not make that element behave like a button. It's just there for semantics. Now, since the table is an appropriate alternative way to present the information in this particular chart that she has, she was able to use the Aria roles, role table, role row, role column, I think, to announce the graph as a table to screen readers, with the information inside of that table announced. So visually, you see a chart, but a screen reader user gets the table with the same kind of information in that chart. But the state of SVG accessibility support is highly inconsistent, even when Aria roles are used to polyfill the semantic information. So generally speaking, even though it can make basic data accessible, it's not completely accessible. So it's a good idea to provide an alternative view of your data. Presenting information using a chart, using a data visualization, make sure that you provide a different way for screen reader users to be able to parse that information. That usually means more work, but that's necessary. Now, I recently worked with Dan Moll and the Super Friendly team to build the 2018 Khan Academy annual report website. It's a really nice little website with a big message that I'm really happy that I got to work on. But the annual report is a report, which means that it contains a lot of information and data about Khan's use across the globe, the impact, the financial information, and much, much more. So the site contained quite a bunch of data visualizations and charts. Now, we had a limited time frame, so the team decided to use static charts. They were not interactive, they were not animated, which means that made things a lot simpler for us, a lot easier. The charts were not complex. Dan created the charts, Dan and Scott Cook. They created the charts in Illustrator. I exported them as SVGs, and I embedded them. Every chart presented a specific piece or amount of information about a specific topic. That works well. So I got those SVGs, and now I was tasked with implementing them in an accessible way. So the first thing I do when I have an SVG, I think about which embedding technique do I want to use to embed it. There are 7 different ways to embed an SVG on a web page. One of them is using the embed tag, which is no longer used, which leaves us with 6 different ways. You can embed it using a background image in CSS, using the image tag, oh, not the IMG typo, sorry. Using the image tag, using the picture, which is similar to image, but it comes with a way to provide default fallback. You can use an iframe, I never do. You can use object, which is very similar to iframe. Both iframe and object have a very nice advantage in that they come with a default fallback mechanism, which means that anything you put between the opening and closing object tags is going to be used as a fallback if your SVG fails to load or if the browser does not support SVG. And then you can also, of course, just put the SVG inline in your HTML document. Now, each one of these techniques has its own pros and cons. Some of them can be animated, some of them cannot, some of them can be interacted with, some of them cannot, some of them can be cached, some of them cannot. So when it comes to embedding any SVG, I usually ask myself a set of questions, and then I choose the embedding technique that I want based on that. Now, usually for charts, my choice is very easy. My decision is easy. I usually go with object because an SVG chart is a very, very, very big SVG file usually, and there is no way I'm going to just dump that into my HTML because it's going to pollute it. And also, because it's very big, I want it to be cached. So I want it to be an external SVG that is going to be cached up on subsequent visits. So that's better for performance, and that's cleaner for my HTML. And also, the content of an object element can be accessed using JavaScript, and it can be animated. So if I ever need to animate my chart, I can do that using JavaScript from the main page. And most importantly, because the object provides me with a way to provide an alternative view for my content. I have a chart, and I need an alternative view. So I start with this, usually. So the initial implementation for all of those charts looks like this. I have an object, it links to my SVG, and then inside of that, as a fallback, I'm using a text description of the content of that chart. So there's the visual representation of that information, and then there is the text representation. I'm using that text representation as a fallback between the opening and closing object tags. Now, okay, cool, so I need to test it with a screen reader now. How is the screen reader going to announce it? First, it was being announced as a frame and using the file name as a name. That wasn't very useful. So the first thing that I did was I added a role image to the object so that it's announced as an image. And yeah, now it's being announced as an image. And because an image needs a name, just like the alt attribute on an image tag, I used AriaLabel to give that image a description. The title of that image describes the content of that image. But it's not the content of that image. It's just a title for what they're seeing. Math usage in Long Beach. But it's not the data itself. Now in the DevTools, it looked better. It says image with the title on top. But the screen reader was still not picking up on the data, on the information inside of that chart. It wasn't being exposed. It just said image with a title. But as a non-sighted user, I cannot see that information. And this is a report. I'm supposed to read information. So it seemed to me that what I wanted to do was, what I was hoping that a screen reader would, since it's not displaying the thing visually, maybe it would pick up the text description between the opening and closing object tags. But it didn't. So the truth is that that fallback between the opening and closing object tags was being hidden from screen readers. It wasn't exposed to screen readers. But I still needed it to be. So how do I go about doing that? Any guesses? Aria described by, exactly. So with the button that we had before, I had a span, and I had a hidden attribute on it. So the span was hidden from a screen reader, but I still wanted it to be announced. I used AriaLabelBy. But instead of using AriaLabelBy here, I use AriaDescribedBy. The difference between AriaLabelBy and AriaDescribedBy is that AriaLabelBy uses an element as an accessible name for that thing, for the object. But this is not a name. I already have a name. I have a label, and that is a name. I want this to be a description, so I use AriaDescribeBy. Also, a very important distinguishing thing between AriaLabelBy and AriaDescribeBy is that the label is announced before the type of the element, but the description is announced after. So in this case, it would say, Khan Academy math usage level in Long Beach, image, small pose, and then it starts describing the information inside of that image. This is exactly what I wanted. Inside of my DevTools, it looked something like this. So it has a role image, it is labeled, it has a label, and it's described by that element over there, that piece of text. Some other charts had a larger piece of text, but that was fine. That was the whole point. I wanted to describe the information inside of my chart. So quick takeaways from this section are, to create accessible data charts, provide an accessible name or label for the graph or the chart, provide an alternative view of the information, or provide a succinct text description of the chart graph or the graph where appropriate or possible. Now, there's something I added here. When I was tabbing through the page, again, when you're building a website and you want to make sure it's accessible, you test it using a screen reader, you test it in several ways. One of these ways is you tab through the page. You want to make sure that you can tab through the links, that everything works just as it's expected. But when I was tabbing through the page, the tab was getting stuck somewhere. I kept tabbing, but I didn't see where I was on the page. I was getting stuck. But then after a little bit of investigation, I noticed that the object element, because it's technically the same as an iframe, it was trapping my focus. So in order to prevent it from being focused, because it's an image, why would I want to focus an image? I added tab index -1, which removes the object from the document tabbing order and now behaves like an image. Speaking of focus, quick note. Never, ever, ever remove or ignore focus styles. If you do want to get rid of the default browser focus styles, only do so if you are going to provide an alternative. Default browser focus styles are usually, they don't usually match the aesthetics of a design, and honestly, they're ugly. I mean, who wants them, right? There is no, I don't think there's a designer on earth that would actually be okay with them. But if you remove them, when you disable them, you leave many users in the dark, and this is especially true when and because they are applied as a result of a mouse or pointer interaction. So if you have the focus styles appearing when you click using a mouse, that is very ugly, and that's why a lot of the developers use this, and I'm guilty of that. I used to do that a few years ago. But focus styles are so important that a visible focus is a requirement for a site to be considered accessible under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. If you don't have a visible focus style, your website is not accessible. If you happen to be in a country where a user can sue you for the inaccessibility of your website, this is one of the easiest things, one of the things that they can easily discover just by tabbing through your page. It's not accessible. They sue you. Now, by not providing focus styles, you're taking away your user's ability to see and know where they are on the page. And this is very similar in concept to hiding the mouse cursor for sighted mouse users. Would you hide their cursors? This is one of my absolute favorite slides by Laura Carvajal. You wouldn't want to hide their cursor, so why would you want to hide their way to tap through the page? If I'm a keyboard user and I want to know where I am on the page, don't take that away from me. Now, avoid overriding default styles unless you're providing a better focus indicator than the one provided by browsers. In fact, it might actually be considered a good practice to override default browser styles and provide your own accessible ones, because default browser styles are inconsistent across browsers, and some of them are not really accessible. So, for example, Firefox and IE show a thin dotted line as a focus indicator, and this indicator can be difficult to see sometimes, unlike the shiny blue outline, which I think became orange eventually in Chrome. So there is a chance to enhance the default focus indicators by designing more effective ones. And an effective indicator would have good contrast, it would be complementary to the shape and size of the element. Color scheme is good, also accessible, enough contrast. It doesn't need to be the same for all elements. Not all elements need to have the same focus style. It should be the same across browsers, though. And ideally, this is what we all want, is we want the focus indicator only applied when the element receives keyboard focus, but not mouse or pointer focus. Now, in CSS today, if you apply this using the focus selector, this focus outline is going to be applied to that element even when it is being clicked with a mouse. And that is not desirable because it's not desirable. So as it happens, we now have another selector in CSS that's instead of focus, we have focus visible. Focus visible, it does exactly the same thing as the focus selector does, except that it only triggers and shows the focus indicator when the element receives focus via the keyboard tabbing. However, browser support for focus visible is currently very, very low, and I think that only Chrome currently supports it. So you can use it as an enhancement. One option is to use it as an enhancement. When we think about enhancement in CSS, we usually think about the supports rule, which allows us to test for whether or not a feature is supported in the browser. If it's supported, we use it. If it's not supported, we don't. So the first thought would be to think about something like this. I want to test for whether or not focus visible is supported, and then remove all the focus styles. But this doesn't work, because we cannot use a selector like this as an argument for the supports feature query. So there's another way around it. You can still use it as an enhancement, but in a different, a little bit hacky, but extremely clever way. So Patrick Klauke wrote an excellent article in which he discusses the current state of focus visible and backwards compatibility. He suggests another CSS-only way to use focus visible today, which looks like this. This is very clever. So you start by, if you have a button, you apply the default focus styles to it. Those styles using the focus selector are going to be applied using whether you're focusing with a mouse or with the keyboard. And then the second declaration, button focus, not focus visible. When the button receives focus that is not focus visible, in other words, when the button receives focus that is not keyboard focus, when the button receives focus that is mouse focus, for example, you undo all of the styles that you defined in the first rule. And then if you want, you can add even more exciting button focus styles inside of focus visible alone. Now, that works, but as I mentioned, it's an enhancement. So if a browser supports focus visible, you hide the focus styles for mouse users. But for other browsers, mouse users are still going to get those styles. So your other option is to use a polyfill. There's a JavaScript polyfill that you can use to get cross-browser support for focus visible. You add that, use the class name. Instead of using focus visible, the selector, use focus visible as a class name. Exactly the same declaration, and you remove the outlines for mouse users. The only note here is something that I fell for a few days ago. Is in my SAS, I was using this declaration, including the one commented out. So I was defining both the native declaration with the polyfill declaration, and that was undoing the polyfill, so the polyfill wasn't working. Because if a browser such as Firefox does not support focus visible, it's going to ignore the entire declaration, including the polyfill one. So what I did is you should be removing or separating the native declaration from the polyfill one. As Patrick says, if you care about backwards compatibility, and you should, until you can absolutely guarantee without any doubt that all of your users will have a browser that supports focus visible, you will always have to either polyfill or use the combination as, or, use it as an enhancement only, or polyfill. But never ever just use focus visible and hide the focus styles natively without a polyfill. So never remove your focus styles. Now, focus styles don't need to be ugly. So what we did in I'm usually the developer, and I think every single one of the designers that I've worked with has never thought about focus styles or designed focus styles until I asked them to do it. So I started building this thing, and Dan, luckily for me, he loves accessibility, he cares about accessibility. So I told him I was using a very random focus style, and I said, would you like to design a focus style that goes more with the art direction of the website? He said yes. So we have this active style using this organic green background, and what we did for the links is use a similar background with a more popping color, which is this yellow one, as a focus indicator. So focus styles don't need to be ugly. They can actually be pretty nice. And using the focus visible polyfill, we ensure that these only appear for keyboard users. Now, a few days ago also, someone on Twitter, I have a lot of conversations on Twitter, Someone on Twitter said that one of the mistakes that developers do is not matching hover styles with focus styles. My response was that I never do. I never match them. You can be a little bit more forgiving with your hover styles because when a user hovers over a link or a button or an element, they already know where they are. So the hover indicator can be more forgiving because I already know where I am. But with focus styles, the user has no context of where they are on the page. They are depending, they are relying on you. So unless you give them something very prominent, something that they can easily see, they could be confused, like they don't know where they are on the page. This is something Hidden said, that where the focus and the hover styles match, and the hover styles are not very strong or standing out a lot, when you're tapping through the interface, it's not obvious where you are, because the hover styles, sometimes it's just a little slight change in color of the text. That's not enough. So again, on the website, what we did, we had this simple hover style, and then using focus was completely different. How much time do I have? Oh, 0, maybe -10 or something. Whoa, okay. Okay, so I'm going to completely skip the next section. Do you want it? Yes. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay, that's like I just got amazing feedback in the middle of my talk. Oh. So this is something very quick. Also, one of the most common UI elements is checkboxes, and native checkboxes are ugly and usually try to style them. We need to make sure that they are styled accessibly. But there's no way to style the native checkbox, so we usually have to hack our way around it. In order to style a checkbox today, we usually hide the native checkbox, and we provide a visual alternative. So visual replacement is usually just that. We have something visual that replaces the checkbox, but if you hide the checkbox in a way that removes it for screen readers, you've messed up, because this checkbox is not there anymore. So we need to make sure that we hide the checkbox accessibly, not using one of the ways that I mentioned before. This is different. And then we style the visual thing that we have. So this is the old way. It's so old that the code was like, I just screenshotted the whole thing. I was too lazy to type it out. So the old way is we used to use a sprite sheet, a PNG sprite sheet, and use the one that looks like that. And then we would use that as a background on our label. And when the checkbox is checked, we use the checkbox hack. We select the label and we move the background. You know, if you're not familiar with it, you're lucky. It's very hacky. It was very clever as well. So, but it's also very wrong on many levels because it's completely not accessible. And another thing is, when you're using an icon as a background image, you have the risk of that background image disappearing in certain environments. I don't have time to go over Windows High Contrast Mode, but Windows High Contrast Mode is one of the environments that the user gets to control. And when you're in Windows High Contrast Mode, background images in older versions of Edge used to be removed completely. So if you have an icon being used as a background image, it disappears. You don't have a checkbox anymore. So generally speaking, this is a general rule for SVG icons. Don't use SVGs as background images because SVGs embedded as background images cannot be styled or tweaked from the CSS. So you run the risk of the image being removed or hidden in Windows High Contrast Mode. SVG background images cannot be transitioned or animated. So you cannot animate them. And the checkbox is a critical icon. What do I mean? So a critical icon in the sense that it needs to be there. Regardless of where the user is, Windows High Contrast Mode or any other environment, they need to see an icon. They need to see it so that they know that this is a checkbox. So if you use a background image, you're risking that the icon would disappear, and you don't want that. So generally speaking, you should be inlining your icons. And if I'm going to style a native checkbox using SVG today, this is what my code would probably start looking like. I have a label. I like to wrap my inputs inside of my label because it increases the tapping area. And then I have my SVG icon, and then I have the actual text of the label. And without any styles applied, this is what it looks like at the bottom right. I have my native checkbox, I have my SVG, and I have my text. Now, I start applying a little bit of styles. If you have an SVG and you want that SVG to scale with the size of the text, use M's instead of pixels to set the size. M is relative to the text size. So if the text becomes bigger or smaller, the icon is going to become bigger or smaller with it. I size the icon, give it width 1em, height 1em, display, position, margin right, etc. And I add a transition so that when I animate it, when I hide and show the checkbox, it's transitioned. And the last step is to hide. No, wait. That's not the last step. OK, so this is what I have here. I have my inbox, my input. When my input, the native input, which is still visible over there, when that input is checked, I use the sibling selector to select the SVG that comes right after it. And I change the fill color. So by default, the fill color of the square was white, and the check mark was also white, so it didn't show. But then I changed the background color so that my checkbox is checked. Also, something that you don't want to forget is ensure that you add a focus style. Because the SVG is a visible thing, it's a visual thing, it cannot be interacted with, but you still want to make it look like it was interacted with. When the native checkbox is checked, you select that SVG and give it an outline, for example, a focus style. And the last step is to hide the checkbox. And this is where the most important part comes in. Which hiding technique would you use for the checkbox? There is a position absolute, but position absolute doesn't hide it. What's that? Move it out of the way to the far left. No. That is one of the most common mistakes. And I'll tell you why now. Hidden attribute, but the hidden attribute makes it display none, which hides it from screen readers too. SR only. SR only is going to shrink the icon, so it's so tiny. Opacity 0. OK, you're getting closer. No, visibility hidden is the same as display none. It's a combination of opacity and position absolute. So the thing that was wrong with the first suggestion, moving the SVG out of the way makes it completely inaccessible. And shrinking it using SR only to a very, very tiny 1 pixel thing also makes it accessible. Why? Because apparently, some users explore your websites by touch. So what does explore by touch mean? Touch interface screen readers, such as mobile phones, allow users to run their finger over the screen to hear what is directly underneath. This provides the user a quick sense of the entire interface. So if I could have a mobile phone, a touch screen, and literally using my finger to find elements on that screen. Where my finger goes, if there's a checkbox underneath my finger, it's being announced. Now, if the checkbox is hidden off canvas, I'm never going to find it. It's not on the page anymore. And if the checkbox is shrunk to a 1 pixel thing, I'm probably also not going to find it. And if I do, I may not be able to interact with it. So both of these ways are inaccessible. This goes to say that there are so many different ways that users could be interacting with your interfaces. And I don't want this to be English is not my first language, so I just missed the word. I don't want this to put you down, you know. The more you relearn, like when I learned about this, I had built an accessible checkbox, and I was so excited. And I have this small UI pattern library that I use in all of my client projects. It has UI patterns styled with very basic styles. And when I have a client project, and it just speeds up my development. I copy the whole thing, and then I change the styles, and I know that it's fully accessible because I built it so. So I built a checkbox, an accessible one, and I was so happy I showed it to Scott, my friend. And as soon as I showed it to him, I was like, Scott, I built this really accessible thing. What do you think about it? And his first response was, I cannot explore it by touch. Yeah, I know. So I learned about this. And that's how we learn about things. We do our best. And if someone says that something is missing, we add that. So that's OK. So in order to hide this checkbox accessibly, this is what we do. So I've set the focus styles in place. I've set the checkbox hack. So first thing I do is I remove the checkbox from the flow of the page using absolute positioning, so it doesn't take any space anymore. Set the width and the height to 1em. This only has an effect in Chrome. It increases the size of the checkbox, which is pretty neat, but only in Chrome. And then I set the opacity to 0. I don't do anything else here. The most important thing to keep in mind, now in this case, that was enough, but in some other cases, like if you're building a toggle switch, you could have one checkbox, and that checkbox could be here, but visually, the toggle is on the other side. What you want to do is you want to make sure that the native checkbox is positioned on top of whatever is visually replacing it. So in my case, this is my visual checkbox. I make sure that the native checkbox is on top of it. If I have a toggle switch, and that's all the way over there, I move my native checkbox and put it on top of my toggle switch. So that when a user exploring by touch, she's going to expect the native checkbox to be here or there. Put it where they expect it to be. Generally speaking, this is a rule for all interactive UI elements. If you need to hide something interactive, make sure that you hide it in a way that does not remove it for touch, a user's exploring by touch. And then again, just a quick focus on focus. Make sure that you add a focus style, like I did here. Again, my SVG in this case, because the SVG is not critical for my screen reader users, they don't need to announce it because they have the native checkbox. It's still there. It's accessible to screen readers. So the SVG, which is replacing it visually, is not important for screen readers anymore. So I use Aria Hidden and Focusable False on it. And this is how you hide interactive elements accessibly. And this is the main CSS declarations. Position absolute, remove it from the flow, hide visually, tweak the size, and position it where it needs to be positioned. This applies also to file input types, because we usually, in order to style those, we have to hide them, to radio buttons, and anything in between. I think 99% of all of the tutorials on the internet that teach you how to create accessible style checkboxes do not mention the thing with the Explore by Touch. Only Scott O'Hara does, and I learned it from him. So if you're looking to learn more about accessibility, I highly recommend following Scott and all of his work. And now I'm done. Thank you.